when you who have identified as people, felons, that can't carry a weapon, if that's what the people in the state of Texas decide, then when a felon's caught with a weapon, he's prosecuted accordingly. But we're not going to make 98% of law-abiding citizens jump through some hoop to carry a gun.
Well, the trick is, under common law, you can't conceal. But under the common law, you can have it open. You can have it open, but the police will still arrest you, even though there's no law.
We got to fix that in Texas.
There's no law against driving around with your pickup truck with a 243 or 30-06, but they'll still arrest you. So as governor, you'd explain to the police that's illegal.
That's correct.
They are committing crimes when they do that.
That's correct. Let's get back to following the law. Let's make sure that county sheriffs understand their proper constitutional role and quit deferring to a militaristic federal state.
Next issue, the border. Guaranteed, if the governor said, we want military veterans, volunteers to go through a quick training course to go down and protect the border. Now when we get shot at, the troops are told to run. They put a few thousand guard on the whole border. They're not even allowed to interdict drugs or anything. What would you do about our border?
We've got to secure that border. Every one of us wants legal immigration coming through the legal ports of entry. Important for trade, important for the economy, important for labor. Legal immigration. Working with local law enforcement, getting down on the border. Spent some time in Hudspeth County just last week talking with the sheriff's department there. You know, they've got one legal port of entry in that county, 96 miles of border with Mexico, one legal port of entry, 9 bridges over the river maintained by the International Boundary Commission. The sheriff said almost to ADA standards. You can get a wheelchair across there, but only one of those is the legal port of entry. I said, why haven't we closed them? He said, if I close them, I'll be thrown in jail. I said, what about the great state of Texas? Can Texas not close those? We need to work with that International Boundary Commission. We're not going to have...
Yeah, notice how we have an international commission controlling our borders.
That's right.
That's what the globalists do. They create private commissions to steal our water, our land. Okay, let's talk about this next. Premises ID, animal ID, a federal regulation, but not a law. But then they do these stunts where the girl that wins for the best heifer at the 4-H club or at the county fair, they then put her in handcuffs, take her off the stage saying, oh, our rule is you've got to have an animal ID, premises ID at your home to be able to show a cow or a pig or some sheep here. There's no law, but the bureaucrats federally are funding the state to harass farmers, ranchers. It was written by big agriculture companies, big poultry producers. They admit to shut down small farms and ranches to force everything onto global big agriculture. What would you do about that as governor with the animal ID and premises ID? Because Texas is the only state in the union to criminally be following the federal edict that's not even a law to enforce this on our farms and ranches.
The executive branch has the opportunity and the tools available to it in interposition to say those federal laws outside of the Constitution will not be enforced in this state. Unilaterally will not be enforced. Make the executive do what the executive ought to be doing. There is no law. It ought not be enforced. And where there is federal law like Real ID, it ought to be nullified by the state legislature in Texas.
And, Governor, would you, because I know you're a big Ron Paul's supporter, in the Fed, organizer, and just you're the best person, and you really are a great lady, have a wonderful presence, a great speaker, very intelligent. I just can't wait for you, if the people rise up, to crush Rick Perry and Kay Bailey Hutchinson and in the primary and to crush the Democrat. I believe this state, if you can win the primary, will not vote for a big government Democrat. The Democrats, people voted for them thinking that they would reverse the tripling of government Bush engaged in. Now Democrats are lower than Republicans in every poll. You are riding in on a wave of resistance to big government. If we can just get you in there, you can win against the Democrats. You can just win this Republican primary that's coming up. And we're going to give those marching orders in a moment and then go to calls. What would you do on property tax and all these new medical districts and things they're creating? Every 4 or 5 months, a new bureaucrat shows up telling me a new tax I have on this TV/radio/film studio. All these new taxes are being erected on me, like we're Massachusetts or New York State or something, or California. The bureaucracy is just going to seed. What would you do about property taxes and all this big government garbage? We
must remember property ownership and gun ownership, essential elements of freedom. Property tax has to go in Texas. not just for the economic implications there, but because it is the thing that is most critical to preserving freedom. You get rid of property tax in Texas. You raise the revenue that you need to fund the bare essential government services with the sales tax. No property tax in Texas. We need that legislation crafted. I'm beginning to say to people, we need to start writing that legislation today so that it is ready to be introduced in January of 2011. We get it through the session in that first 5 months and we get it done. We get rid of property tax in Texas.
Here's another thing we're dealing with. They passed a Senate bill a few sessions ago where school districts can now have, on top of property tax, a school district tax. And I was sitting there with one of my great cousins, call him an uncle, but and I was sitting there with Pat this weekend before we went to a funeral in East Texas, and he sits there on about 40 acres. He lives in a double-wide trailer. It's nice, but he's an Army veteran of 20-something years. He's not rich. And he said, Alex, this new school board tax was $900 last year, but it was closer to $10,000 this year, a 9-fold increase. And he said, what is this? And I didn't even know what it was. I mean, there's so many new taxes, I can't even keep track of it. And luckily, he then worked for the prisons, and then he worked for a few years for the post office, so he's a triple retiree. But other people around there can't even afford their gas to pay all these taxes. He doesn't own his land anymore. He pays a giant rent to the local school board. The local boss hogs are stealing the money in Buffalo and Fairfield. I mean, when is this going to end? We're
all tenants, aren't we?
Yes.
Tenants in our own homes. You get rid of property tax in Texas. You restore true private property ownership. You create economic incentive. You create economic activity. You see a $3 billion increase in net personal income in Texas. You add 125 to 175,000 new jobs just by eliminating the property tax.
And they buy more stuff. All the studies show it. And you actually get higher revenue. And government knows when you cut taxes, revenue goes up because people spend more. But they want control of the economy. They don't want a good economy.
Well, I want a good economy. I want a free state. I visited with a man recently who immigrated here from Cuba, and I said 3 years ago he left Cuba, had been there 4 generations. I said, if I were to take a picture of you standing on the street in Cuba in a communist dictatorship, take a picture of you standing on the street in Austin, Texas in a constitutional republic, what's the difference between the man in Cuba and the man in Austin? And he said, the man in Cuba has no dreams. Everything was free. Healthcare was free. Education was free. I had no dreams. I could not plan to live somewhere, go somewhere, or work somewhere. I had no dreams. We don't want that in Texas. That's where we're headed. If we do not remember property ownership, gun ownership keeps men free, and stand on those two things without compromise and without surrender, regardless of how many potholes need to be filled, how many new police officers need to be hired, how many new school buildings need to be built, we better remember first that it's about freedom first.
Well, we built the state and the country without all these taxes. We had a 10% national growth rate until we got the Federal Reserve. Now it's at about 2%, and things are rotting and falling apart. Government takes our money and then gives us a little bit of it back with strings attached. I want to go to calls and then give marching orders here for folks that want to get involved in the final segment, but I did want to bring up the Austin police chief. The legislature passed a law. They can take blood without warrants now. What you would do as governor?
Interpose. Fight against that kind of bad legislation. Veto the legislation. Work with the legislature to get that corrected. And in the meantime, interpose where we could. Work with the Texas Attorney General to stop that kind of behavior. We cannot violate those inherent constitutional rights that people have.
What about the director of DPS that's going off these federal reports saying Ron Paul supporters are terrorists, in the Fed people are terrorists, gun owners are terrorists, and that Homeland Security is really for veterans?
We've got a big problem in Texas. We've got a lot of work to do to re-educate. I've seen some activity.
We got Soviet brainwashing in the state police.
We do. And I've seen some activity at the grassroots level. People are doing some innovative things. I think it goes back to the county sheriff. We've got to work with county sheriffs to make sure that they understand their constitutional duty to protect the citizens of their county using the U.S. Constitution and the state constitution. Re-educate all of ourselves as to the proper role of a constitutional republic. Grassroots activists can help with that. Get in there, talk to your county sheriff, help them understand, maybe share Sheriff Mac's book with your county sheriff. Get that dialogue going. Let's put county sheriffs back in charge of law enforcement and not have either a federal military police state or a state police.
And by the way, the Viper teams nationwide are now setting up checkpoints on bridges, checkpoints out in the countryside, border checkpoints 100 miles in. I mean, they admit they want to put metal detectors in malls. They want to turn all of the U.S. into a giant prison. They want parents to have a license to have children. That's being discussed by the bureaucrats. I mean, the government is run by a bunch of control freaks. Let's go to some phone calls. Ronnie in Texas, you're on the air with... Yeah, you can go ahead and put your headphones on. Ronnie in Texas, you're on the air with Debra Medina, Republican candidate in the primary, neck and neck in many polls with the other establishment candidates. Go ahead, Ron.